Hello and welcome. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey into a world where sleep was not always peaceful and dreams were guarded by stone. This is the story of an emperor who tried to conquer time itself and the thousands of silent warriors who were buried to watch over his endless slumber. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let us drift into the sad history of sleep, the China story of the Terracotta tomb of Qin Shi Huang. If you enjoy slow stories like this to help you relax or fall asleep, don't forget to subscribe, leave a gentle like, and let me know in the comments which forgotten tale you'd like to dream through next.
Hey guys, tonight we drift deep underground, beneath layers of earth, past silent rows of stone soldiers, and into the heart of a tomb so massive, it might just be the loneliest sleep chamber in human history. You'll feel the cold dampness of the lush soil, taste a hint of iron in the air, and wonder, like thousands before you, what exactly lies sealed behind those ancient walls, untouched for over 2,000 years. This isn't just a bedtime tale. It's a journey through the sad history of sleep in ancient China, starting with the most ambitious, anxiety-riddled nap plan ever conceived, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China. Think of it as a mausoleum built by someone who really didn't want to die, and had the entire workforce of an empire to help him pretend he never did. And yeah, you probably won't survive this. If you were a laborer in 221 BCE, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me your location and what time it is where you are. Always fascinating to see where we're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. That you're standing at the edge of Xi'an, once the bustling capital of ancient China's most powerful dynasty. Now, it's a city resting atop centuries of secrets. About 35 meters below you, deeper than most subway systems, is the burial site of Qin Shi Huang, a rectangular mausoleum complex that spans over 50 square kilometers. That's bigger than some modern-day cities. A single tomb, with an ego the size of a nation, and a floor plan modeled after his entire empire. This wasn't a sleep you could wake up from. And he made sure no one else could, either. The place isn't just dark, it's designed to erase light. According to early records, the tomb chamber mimics the night sky, dotted with constellations made from glowing pearls. Above you, fake stars. Below you, lakes of liquid mercury representing China's great rivers. Probably not the safest water feature for indoor use. But we'll get to that. Right now, you're still at the threshold. The emperor didn't want to sleep forever like a humble monk. No, he wanted to live forever inside his tomb. And so, it wasn't called a grave. It was called a palace. The land around you is still shaped by the effort it took to build the thing. Rolling hills that look natural are actually artificial, part of a massive dirt mound meant to seal the emperor beneath layers of silence. Farmers who stumbled upon the terracotta warriors in 1974 were only scratching the surface. They found the outer guards, the pawns. The emperor himself? Still untouched. Historians still argue whether this preservation is from respect, fear, or just a bureaucratic nightmare. After all, it's hard to get funding to excavate a place potentially filled with deadly traps and toxic metals. It's the ultimate do not disturb sign. But step back a moment. This giant, suffocating dream wasn't built overnight. It took nearly 700,000 workers, many of whom didn't live to see it finished. People slept in tents, under carts, in the dirt. Some slept beside the bricks they'd just fired. Some collapsed after days of hauling granite blocks from distant quarries. And some, they were buried alive to ensure they'd never speak about the secrets within. Don't worry. You'll get used to the quiet down here. The tomb's inner layout was so secretive that even modern radar can't map it fully. Archaeologists using magnetic resonance tools say there's a central chamber, maybe more than one. But they're hesitant to open it, thanks to some grim warnings in the records of the Grand Historian, a book written by Sima Qian not long after the emperor's death. In it, He describes rivers of mercury flowing through the tomb, mercury-powered mechanical traps, and ceilings laced with crossbows ready to fire on intruders. Whether any of that still works is a question no one wants answered at point-blank range. But beyond the engineering, beyond the scale and suspicion, you begin to feel something else. A sadness. Not just for the emperor who feared death so much that he built a city to contain it, but for everyone who helped him build that dream, then vanished into it. One fringe theory, barely whispered in academic circles, suggests that the emperor believed his sleep chamber could connect him with the heavens. That through some mystical alignment of Mercury flows and star maps, his consciousness could roam the universe like a celestial bureaucrat, assigning stars to constellations as he once assigned laws to counties. Was that sleep or something else? Tonight, you stand outside the entrance to this colossal insomnia machine, and in the whispering wind that comes off the burial mound, you almost think you hear the clink of armor, not from the soldiers above ground, but from the tomb's interior. Waiting, watching, wondering if you'll come closer. You don't, of course, because you're smarter than that. Instead, you lie back in your bed, letting your mind sink just a little deeper into the dirt, just a little further toward that underground echo chamber where emperors never wake up. And that's only the beginning.
You close your eyes, but the story pulls you backward. Centuries before the tomb was filled with silent warriors or deadly trickle streams of mercury. Before the crossbows were hidden, the architects silenced, and the dreamers buried. Before the word emperor even attached itself like a shadow to his name, that he was just Zheng, a boy, born in 259 BCE in the warring state of Qin, one of 7 fractured kingdoms across what is now China. A child with the kind of upbringing that could either produce a philosopher or a control freak. Guess which one we got? Zheng's early life was not a gentle lullaby. His father, a prince, spent more time with concubines and schemes than he did with bedtime stories. His mother, embroiled in palace intrigues, was busy. And Zheng? Well, Zheng had tutors. Lots of tutors. The kind who believed that sleep was a sign of moral weakness and that true rulers didn't blink, let alone nap. Imagine you're him, 8 years old, sitting in a candlelit study while a man in a long robe drones on about military formations and crop tax records. Outside, thunder rumbles. Inside, you're not allowed to yawn. One scholar allegedly gave him an herbal eye rinse that was supposed to increase alertness. What it actually did was sting like betrayal and keep him up all night. Some fringe accounts even claim that the young prince slept upright, strapped into a seat like a nocturnal prisoner of ambition. Historians still argue whether these techniques were real or just exaggerated stories passed down by later dynasties trying to paint him as inhuman. Either way, it worked. Zheng grew up knowing that sleep was not a comfort. It was an enemy. He began to see the world as something to be conquered, not rested in. Peace was a pause in conquest, not its reward. And so he studied and memorized and scowled. The kind of child who didn't ask for bedtime stories, but memorized military treatises and asked for maps. And when he did dream, he never told anyone what he saw. Age 13, he was king. Or rather, the figurehead king of Qin with adult regents doing the actual ruling. Classic setup. Child monarch, overly ambitious ministers, and probably more backstabbing than the final season of a TV show we don't name anymore. But Zheng wasn't one to stay sidelined. He watched, he waited, and he didn't sleep on the job. Quite literally. One tale, half legend, half record, says that a regent once joked about taking a break from power. Zheng removed him the next morning and replaced him with someone more allergic to naps. Over the next decade, Zheng consolidated power. Slowly, methodically, like someone assembling a very grim bedtime routine. Dim the lights, eliminate your enemies, tuck in your ambition, fluff your control complex. And as he grew older, the idea of sleep became even more fraught. By his mid-20s, he was surrounded by whispering ministers, traveling healers, and strange herbal concoctions. Some mixtures were meant to prevent nightmares. Others were meant to stop dreams entirely. A few may have been made of ground-up jade, which, for the record, is terrible for digestion. A fringe scholar named Meng Shui speculated that Zhang developed an early form of sleep anxiety, paranoid that while he rested, plots would unfold, kingdoms would rise, and he would fall. He slept with a sword nearby. Sometimes two. Sometimes in different rooms on different nights to avoid assassination attempts. That's not sleep. That's rotating paranoia. Point 1 Ancient tablet fragment even describes a contraption in the palace resembling a kind of mobile bed surrounded by bronze mirrors, meant to reflect energy and repel ghost spirits from the dream world. Imagine trying to nod off with your own terrified face staring back at you from every angle. And then, just as he was entering his prime, he decided that the fractured lands of China shouldn't exist anymore. At least not as separate kingdoms. He wanted one name, one rule, one map, and one sleep schedule. And so the conquests began. State by state, the wars ground forward. Chu, Zhao, Yen. Each fell like chapters in a book Zhang refused to stop reading. Blood soaked the scrolls of history, but Zhang just kept moving. One battle report claims he once went 3 days without sleep, inspecting the dead and reassigning generals by torchlight. An emperor who blinks, he allegedly told an advisor, loses 2 provinces. That's not healthy. That's an espresso addiction in armor. By 221 BCE, he had done the unthinkable, unified the states under one name. He renamed himself Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin, and rebranded China as a centralized empire. Taxes, roads, laws, measurements, all standardized. Even the width of wagon axles was regulated so carts wouldn't jam on imperial roads. He'd basically invented the DMV before inventing pillows. And yet, even at the height of power, the man did not rest. He began speaking more openly of his fear of death, of needing to rule forever. He reportedly summoned astrologers in the dead of night, desperate to know if the stars had shifted in his favor. He drank strange brews made from sulfur and mica. One account says he tried breathing through golden straws while sleeping to filter decay. A mainstream fact, he ordered the construction of the mausoleum at Mount Lee, the very tomb we just entered, in the same year he declared himself emperor. That's right. First thing he did after becoming ruler of all China? Start planning his deathbed. Because Qin Shi Huang didn't believe sleep was rest. He believed it was rehearsal for eternity. And you, lying there now, tucked in with a blanket or maybe curled on a couch, you can feel it, the heavy press of that belief, that if you build a fortress strong enough, wide enough, deep enough, you might just outlast your own mortality. But that's a lot of pressure to put on a nap. So now you're drifting through candlelit halls of policy scrolls and hard stone floors where slippers never padded and silence was enforced. You're in the palace, just after Qin Shi Huang has declared himself emperor. He has the world, or at least a big chunk of China, under his control. You'd think, after all that conquest, he might allow himself a little nap. Nope. Because conquering the external world was just half the job. The other half, conquering the past. And this emperor had insomnia that echoed backward through time. You sit at the edge of a meeting chamber, where scribes tremble in long robes, waiting to see if they'll be spared. In front of them lies a pile of books, Confucian texts, histories, records, philosophies, all considered dangerous bedtime reading. Why? Because they offered competing versions of the world. Versions where rulers were wise but not cruel. Where the past could be a guide, not a threat. Qin Shi Huang didn't like that. So in 213 BCE, he issued an edict. All texts not directly serving the state, especially Confucian classics and private historical records, were to be burned. Overnight, public fires rose across the empire. Flames that licked up knowledge, history, and sleepy-time poems written in softer times. And yes, this included bedtime stories. One lesser-known fringe detail, a banned children's book from the state of Chu titled The Sparrow's Last Nest, was reportedly ordered destroyed because it taught the lesson that small things can escape empires. Historians still argue whether the emperor's real goal was to control thought or simply to clear away distractions from the one truth, his own. Either way, the result was a cultural blackout. It's like deciding no one in your kingdom is allowed to dream unless it's your dream. The irony? He didn't even seem that interested in reading himself. But he knew others were. And if you're the only one awake while everyone else is reading stories, well, that's how paranoia begins. Some scholars tried to protest. Not a great move. Legend has it that around 460 Confucian scholars were buried alive or forced to labor on the emperor's projects until death. Again, this part's debated. Some claim the numbers were exaggerated by later dynasties to make the Qin look more monstrous. But you can feel the dread in the air, the stillness, the way every courtier chose their words like stepping stones over a frozen river. You don't sleep well in a place where books are burned and poets disappear. And yet, all this repression wasn't done in the name of chaos. It was for order. Qin Shi Huang wanted one legal code, one script, one set of characters. He simplified the Chinese writing system, standardized currency, weights, even cart axle width, as we said before, the original micromanager. You know the phrase sleeping like a baby? Yeah, this guy slept like an over-caffeinated spreadsheet. Imagine lying in a palace chamber at night. Stone walls, silence so thick you could slice it with a hairpin. But there's no rest. Somewhere, someone might be writing. Someone might be remembering. You wake from a doze and demand to know if anyone copied a forbidden poem from memory. That's how tense it was. Scribes, awake at odd hours, may have rehearsed texts only in their minds, afraid that a single stray slip of paper could be their undoing. A curious tidbit. One poet, whose name is lost to history, allegedly wrote his verses on thin rice dough, then boiled and ate them to hide the evidence. Poetry you couldn't even digest. Qin Shi Huang would have been proud. And amid all this control, the emperor continued planning his tomb. More laborers, more orders. A hidden empire beneath the empire. Like a second China. Quieter, sadder, and destined to remain sealed forever. You get the sense he was putting all the dreams he didn't trust into that place. Burying them where they couldn't be read, remembered, or rebelled. He was building silence. Not peace. There's something uniquely terrifying about a man who can't let other people dream. It's not just that he burns books, it's that he burns possibilities. That he wants sleep to be empty of imagination. And if you can't control your own thoughts before bed, what can you control? Fringe thinkers believe the emperor didn't just fear death, but feared unconsciousness itself. That he saw dreaming as a kind of treason. Because if you're dreaming, you're inventing. And inventing leads to alternatives. And alternatives, well, that's a slippery slope to dynasty toppling. So night after night, the emperor continued pacing marble corridors, mumbling to alchemists, rewriting laws by moonlight. A ruler who never rested, commanding a population that wasn't allowed to. And here's the wild twist. Even as he forced conformity on everyone else, he surrounded himself with mystics and magicians. The man who hated imagination depended on it for his own survival plans. He needed their elixirs, their omens, their promises of life without end. Which brings us to the most exhausting part of all. He didn't want anyone else to dream, but he refused to wake up from his own. Now your thoughts trail like incense smoke into the labor camps, those long, groaning fields of mud, stone, and silence where the emperor's tomb slowly, relentlessly took shape. You're not walking here, you're trudging, because the scale of the construction wasn't just vast. It was soul-crushing. Imagine nearly 700,000 workers, not soldiers, not officials, ordinary people, farmers pulled from their villages, convicts condemned for stealing grain, artisans with rare skills. Some offered promises of food and safety. Others were simply taken. They slept where they could, under ox carts, inside pottery kilns, or pressed shoulder to shoulder in makeshift barracks with no roofs. The tomb site at Mount Lee became one of the largest forced labor projects in recorded history. Not that much was recorded. Qin Shi Huang didn't like documenting the messy stuff. He preferred blueprints and legends. But scraps remain. Accounts whispered down generations. One poem etched by a grieving brother into the underside of a discarded bowl reads, roughly, "He dreamed of gold, so we gave our breath. He dreamed of stars, so we gave our backs. And the hours? Endless. Workers cut through rocky mountainsides, dug massive trenches, carried tons of dirt, brick, and bronze by hand. Some estimates say the outer wall of the complex alone stretched nearly 7 kilometers. That's not a tomb. That's a prison for eternity, built while everyone was still alive." Quirky fact here. One chamber beneath the tomb was allegedly designed to simulate weather. Artificial storms made by copper piping. Not to please the emperor's soul, but to remind it of the power it once commanded. The workers saw none of that. They didn't see the vision, just pain, calluses, and the nightly struggle to find sleep while surrounded by the dying. Diseases swept the camps. Malaria, dysentery, infections from untreated wounds. If you were lucky, you got 3 hours of sleep under a broken piece of tent cloth. If you were unlucky, you were buried before dawn in the same pit you helped dig. Some scholars still argue whether these laborers were slaves in the traditional sense or state workers. But let's be honest. When your job is eternal grave building and the exit is a burial trench, that's not a gig you applied for on purpose. But here's the thing that haunts you. Even in those worst conditions, people found ways to rest. One excavated leather pouch, found decades ago near a collapsed kiln, contained a crushed herbal bundle. A sleep sachet, likely made from mugwort, lavender, and wild chrysanthemum. Someone, even here, wanted better dreams. That's the human part. In a place where ambition carved mountains and death came by the hour, someone still carried a pillow made of dried flowers. And you get the creeping sense. Maybe the emperor didn't plan for that. You see, sleep is stubborn. You can crush bones, but you can't crush a yawn. Laborers whispered lullabies in dialects long since lost. They carved little animals into bricks. One clay tile pulled from a worker's trench has a tiny smiling fish etched on its underside, invisible unless flipped. A secret joke, a secret hope, or maybe just a quiet middle finger to the man who demanded everyone dream of him. Meanwhile, the tomb rose. First came the outer walls, then the central chamber, deep, cold, and sealed off. A skeleton crew of artisans created mechanisms to keep it airtight. Some passages were designed to flood automatically if breached. Ventilation tunnels were buried as soon as the last stone was laid. A mainstream historical fact. Over 8,000 terracotta soldiers were made to guard this tomb. Not mass-produced, each with distinct faces, hairstyles, and uniforms. That took time. It took artists who worked on scaffolding by torchlight, painting faces in silence. Fringe theory alert. Some believe these faces weren't just imaginative. They were modeled on real people, the very soldiers or workers who built the tomb. Not as tribute, but as surveillance. So even in death, the emperor would be watched by the ones he ruled. Let that sink in. Imagine falling asleep, if you ever managed to, knowing your own face might be used to guard the man who broke your back. And when the tomb neared completion, the whispers got darker. The workers who laid the final stones, who sealed the Mercury canals and smoothed the trapdoor mechanisms, they never came back out. Some say they were locked in, buried alive with their tools. Others say they were taken away in secret, executed, their families paid to keep quiet. Historians still argue whether this part of the legend is true or a metaphor for the total control the emperor exercised. But if it is true, it means thousands of people went to bed one night thinking about tomorrow's breakfast, and instead woke up to find the door bricked shut. And above them, the emperor's dream chamber waited, empty still, but not for long. You imagine yourself lying in that dirt, eyes half open, listening to the last muffled sounds of movement overhead. The hammering fades, the breathing stills, and you, like the rest, fade into that strange space between exhaustion and oblivion. Because sometimes the saddest part of sleep is when you don't even realize it was your last one. Now you drift further in, not through gates or tunnels, but through rows of faces. Rows upon rows, stretching into the dark. It's not silence you hear anymore. It's the weight of attention. Because every one of these thousands of clay soldiers is looking right at you. You're standing among the Terracotta army. No blinking. No sighs. No sleep. Just a permanent military stare down, carved from earth over 2,000 years ago, with the sort of detail you'd expect from a sculptor with serious control issues, and an emperor breathing down his neck. Each warrior is unique. You notice it right away. The hair is different. The brows. The subtle smirks or stone-cold frowns. Some stand straight-backed, others more relaxed, leaning slightly as if they've been waiting too long. Some even have mustaches so finely etched you wonder if a sculptor was sneaking in a joke. A mainstream historical fact. Over 8,000 life-size figures have been uncovered, including infantrymen, archers, charioteers, cavalry, musicians, and even acrobats. That's not just a security detail. That's an entire underground society, built to serve Qin Shi Huang in death the way the living served him in life. You walk through the formations, past hollow torsos and stiff limbs. The figures were originally painted in bright colors, reds, blues, greens, before time and oxygen stole the pigments away. Now they're pale and cracked, like ghostly mannequins on eternal night watch. But here's the part that makes it weirder. They weren't buried with him. Not inside the tomb anyway. They're outside, guarding the perimeter, stationed in pits that were sealed up long before the emperor's body was even laid to rest. These aren't roommates. They're the night shift. And oh, were they armed. Originally, every soldier held a real weapon, bronze swords, spears, crossbows, even halberds. But when archaeologists uncovered them in the 1970s, most of the weapons were missing. Looted? Maybe. Or maybe removed by later dynasties, who were less excited about the idea of a ghost army ready to wake up swinging. Still, fragments remain. Blades so sharp they still cut paper after 2,000 years. That's what happens when you cast them with a chromium oxide coating, something not seen again until modern metallurgy. Historians still argue whether this level of technology was an accidental discovery or the result of highly advanced experimentation. Either way, it's creepy how well it's held up, like it's still waiting for something. Now here's the quirky part. While most of the soldiers look ready for battle, some of them don't. One kneeling archer has a faint grin, as though caught mid-thought. A cavalryman has lips so gently pursed he looks like he might be whistling. Even stranger, one terracotta head has ears that don't match, one large and curled, one flat and folded. Scholars jokingly call him Private Lopsided. Was it a mistake? A joke? Or was someone out there slipping in a message? A quiet rebellion baked into the clay? And you start to wonder, why all the effort? It wasn't enough to build a tomb, or a palace, or a river of Mercury. The emperor needed a whole army to follow him. Not the real men, of course, he didn't trust them. Real soldiers can mutiny, but clay soldiers? They obey forever. They never sleep, never age, never whisper rebellion in the dark. It's almost tragic. Qin Shi Huang, the most powerful man in China, couldn't sleep without thousands of imaginary friends watching the door. There's a theory, one of the more fringe ones, that the emperor believed in some form of afterlife bureaucracy, that when he died he'd need guards, messengers, entertainers, accountants, maybe even spies. And so the army wasn't just protection, it was administration. He was building his own eternal kingdom, one where he'd still be in charge. But that raises another question. Was he expecting a threat? Was there an enemy waiting on the other side? Maybe that's why the soldiers face outward, not inward toward the tomb. They weren't watching him, they were defending him. From what? Bandits? Spirits? Regret? You keep walking through the pit, your footsteps soft on ancient earth. In your mind, you picture the sculptors, hundreds of them, shaping clay, carving eyelids, smoothing jawlines. One artist reportedly wrote his name on the heel of a terracotta boot. Just once. A flicker of selfhood in a world ruled by uniformity. Some scholars say this army was meant to intimidate. Others say it was meant to comfort. But deep down, you feel it was something else entirely. It was a monument to the emperor's fear of being alone. Because real soldiers eventually fall asleep. Real people die. But statues? Statues stay. Statues wait. Statues remember. And as you lie in bed now, your eyes growing heavy, you imagine them still standing there. Quiet, patient, unblinking. Like an audience of sentinels, keeping watch through centuries. Holding vigil not just over a tomb, but over the restless dream of a man who tried to outlive time. And all he got was clay. You descend even deeper now, beneath the rows of terracotta eyes, under the palace ruins, beyond the orderly geometry of the burial complex. The soil thickens, the light dims to memory, and the air tastes faintly metallic. Because here, beneath the ground, flowed rivers. But not the kind with fish. You're floating now in imagination, as scholars have done for centuries, drifting through the eerie underground palace said to contain lakes and rivers of Mercury. Yes, Mercury, the liquid metal you were once told not to touch in school. In Qin Shi Huang's tomb, according to ancient texts, it was everywhere. Sima Qian, China's grand historian, writing about a century after the emperor's death, claimed that these underground waterways were constructed to mimic China's geography. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, the seas, all replicated in miniature, flowing through an artificial landscape under the tomb chamber's ceiling. And not just mapped. Pressurized mechanisms allegedly sent Mercury streaming in motion, curving, churning, shimmering in the dark. Now it's true. We haven't opened the main chamber. No one has. But modern soil analysis around the mound does show abnormally high mercury levels. Some tests even suggest there's still liquid mercury trapped inside. So yeah, there's probably a toxic river running quietly beneath your feet. Mainstream scholars accept that mercury was used symbolically. It represented immortality, the divine, and the ethereal. Taoist alchemists believed mercury had transformative properties. Spoiler alert, they were kind of right. Just not in the way they hoped. One fringe theory claims the tomb's layout wasn't symbolic, but functional. That the emperor believed Mercury's flow, its constant, fluid motion, would somehow keep his spirit moving too. Like blood for a buried body. A circulatory system for a stone corpse. That's not just ambition. That's sleep so deep you need hydraulics. And then there's the ceiling, allegedly studded with pearls to simulate the stars, constellations mapped exactly, so that even in death the emperor could look up and navigate the sky. Because dreaming wasn't enough. He needed to control where he went in the dream. You're beginning to see it now. Aren't you? This wasn't a tomb. It was a planetarium. A poison-laced command center for a man who planned to rule the afterlife the same way he ruled the living one. Absolutely. But Mercury doesn't make good sleep medicine. One lesser-known detail from ancient medical texts. Prolonged exposure to mercury causes hallucinations, paranoia, trembling, and insomnia. Some accounts of Qin Shi Huang's final years describe increasingly erratic behavior. Sudden rages, fearful outbursts, even talking to shadows. His bodyguards reportedly took shifts in case he woke screaming at night. Historians still argue whether the mercury already existed in the tomb before he died, or whether the plan was to flood the chambers after burial. Either way, it wasn't a spa treatment. It was a mode of madness. You're lying still now, imagining those glowing mercury rivers. Silent, slick, unnaturally bright. No fish, no reeds, just chemical light slithering through stone channels. You wonder what it would feel like to stand beside one. To feel its hum, to reach out a hand. No, better not. And if the rivers weren't enough, the tomb was rumored to contain mechanical traps. crossbows triggered by pressure plates, arrows that would fire from hidden slits, levers that, if tripped, would cause collapse or release gas. That's right. This tomb might be booby-trapped. Scholars say it was a genuine concern, enough that, even in modern times, no one has dared open the central burial chamber. It's been scanned, it's been theorized, but no one has cracked it open. Why? Maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear, or maybe because, deep down, we understand what kind of mind builds a river of Mercury, and no, we're not invited. A quirky rumor from local folklore. If you sleep too close to the mound during certain times of year, you'll dream of drowning in silver. Some villagers claim the Mercury has a spirit of its own now, that it remembers the man it was built for, and that it doesn't like to be disturbed. Silly? Maybe. But you're not going camping there, are you? So now you're curled up under your covers, your fingers warm, your breath slow, your thoughts flickering like torchlight against old cave walls. You think about all the people who touched that Mercury, who carved the channels, soldered the seams, stirred the poison, and kept going. Eyes red, skin burning, hands shaking. Still building. You think about what it means to design a tomb so advanced, so dangerous, and so unsleeping. A tomb that punishes intruders and protects an emperor who may no longer know he's dead. And you think, maybe sleep isn't just about rest. Maybe, for some, it's about control. The illusion of control. Of trying to choreograph what comes after the final breath. To script eternity. But you, right now, need no such thing. You don't need rivers of Mercury. You just need silence. Stillness. A dream or two that doesn't require engineering. Because while Qin Shi Huang built a kingdom of restless stone, you're building something quieter. Something softer. Just a night's sleep. You press further into the tomb. Not with shovels or flashlights, but through the drifting hush of stories and suspicion. By now, you've passed clay soldiers, streams of silver death, and pearl-studded ceilings. You've felt the weight of ambition and the pull of silence. And now? Now you're standing at the doorstep of fear. Because there's a rumor still whispered in both academic journals and rainy night village gossip. The tomb is booby-trapped. Not metaphorically. Literally. Imagine ancient engineers hunched over blueprints made of silk, crafting deadly puzzles in near darkness. Pressure plates hidden under tiles. Bronze darts rigged to shoot through stone slits. Crossbows cocked and sealed behind walls, waiting. And waiting. According to the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian. Palaces and scenic towers were built for 100 officials, and the tomb was filled with rare artifacts and wonderful treasure. Craftsmen were ordered to make automatic crossbows primed to shoot at anyone who enters. Now, sure, it sounds like something out of an Indiana Jones script. But Sima Qian wasn't known for fantasy. And considering what's already been found, Mercury readings, sealed chambers, and silent formations of deathly still soldiers, well, you start to wonder. Historians still argue whether these traps were ever built, or whether they're symbolic of the emperor's paranoia. But satellite imaging and geophysical scans have revealed anomalies beneath the tomb. Unnatural voids, mechanisms, maybe, or just ghosts with good posture. You walk slowly through this idea. Imagine being the artisan asked to install a death trap for your own tomb. There's a kind of poetry in it. Dark, unfunny poetry. Fringe researchers suggest the traps weren't just about protection, but ritual. That the act of building a deadly chamber was itself part of the emperor's spiritual defense. Like ringing a home with salt, but with way more engineering and about 1,000% more homicide. And here's a quirky twist. Some ancient trap blueprints from other tombs of the era have been found on bronze slips. One describes a hidden compartment that drops burning resin onto intruders. Another features a false corridor that leads directly to a pit of spikes. These weren't boogeyman bedtime tales. They were state-of-the-art death deterrents. You lie there in your own quiet chamber, imagining the builders of Qin Shi Huang's tomb working at midnight, whispering over boiling lead and tensioned cords. They would have worked barefoot so as not to echo. They would have tied each other into ropes and lowered themselves into tight shafts. They would have placed mechanisms designed never to be touched again. A machine built not for performance but prevention. And after the last trigger was set, after the final bolt clicked into its kill position, they weren't allowed to leave. One chilling passage suggests that artisans who knew the layout were sealed inside after completing their work. Whether buried alive or executed just outside the gate, they were silenced. Permanently, because if you know where the traps are, you're not allowed to sleep anywhere else. Sleep in this world was conditional. Conditional on secrecy, on usefulness, on silence. It's strange to think that a culture so richly steeped in ancestor worship, in honoring the dead, in poetry and porcelain and precision, could also engineer terror with this level of commitment. But maybe it's not so strange. Maybe it's just what happens when fear gets a budget. You turn over in bed, now feeling how fear must have pressed into the bones of those final workers. You wonder if any of them left a message behind. A carved signature hidden under a tile. Poem etched on a brick. Forgive us. We were ordered. Or maybe just their name. But no such messages have been found. Not yet. Just row upon row of hollowed passageways, false floors, and a central chamber no one dares open. And so the emperor sleeps or doesn't, within a palace wrapped in silence, stone, and traps, because even in death, he couldn't relax. What was he afraid of? Robbers? Rivals? Some cosmic judgment? Or something even more human? Like waking up alone, you start to feel the air go still in your room. No arrows. No stone slabs shifting. Just your breath. Just the quiet. But still, your imagination drifts back to the idea of a weaponized dream. A tomb so defended, it became a fortress that outlived its king. There's an ancient phrase written on a stone seal found near a lesser Qin noble's tomb. To sleep without watchmen is to risk dreams. And yet, maybe the real trap isn't the crossbow. Maybe it's the belief that death is something you can outsmart. You're safer where you are. In your own bed. No pressure plates. No mercury streams. No soldiers judging your pajamas. Just soft air, steady breath, and a story old enough to guard your rest instead of threaten it. Let the emperor keep his defenses. You've got something better. You stir gently, deeper into the echoing tomb, but now the air thickens not with poison or traps, but with silence. A particular kind of silence. The kind that follows a final breath. Because now, we've reached the part no one can skip. The emperor dies at its 210 BCE. Qin Shi Huang is on the road, as usual. He never stopped moving, always chasing immortality, always looking for the next alchemist, the next pill, the next spell that might cancel the natural order of things. But on this journey, something goes wrong. Somewhere between the provinces of Hebei and Shandong, his body falters. Historians agree that he died of an illness, most likely poisoning, and yes, it's widely believed he was ingesting mercury-based elixirs at the time. Irony. Anyone? You build a tomb to avoid death and take poison trying to escape it. But here's where the story gets strange. The emperor's death wasn't announced. Not immediately. He was too important, too feared. And his court officials, especially his chancellor, the deeply loyal or deeply scheming, Li Si, were terrified that if word got out too soon, chaos would break loose. Assassins, rebellions, provinces defecting. The whole dynasty could crumble before the corpse even cooled. So what did they do? They faked it. They kept his death a secret, continued issuing orders in his name. They propped up his body in the royal carriage. They fed his horses. They kept his entourage moving like nothing had happened. And here's the strangest, most vivid historical detail. They carted around barrels of rotten fish to mask the smell of his decaying body. Yes, that's a real historical fact. You don't have to imagine too hard. A royal convoy slowly making its way back toward the capital, trying to keep an empire stitched together with fish guts and forged signatures. At night, the emperor rested in his carriage, curtains drawn. No one dared disturb him. Even in death, Qin Shi Huang demanded obedience. Lic, the chancellor, along with the eunuch Zhao Gao, didn't just cover up the death, they edited the succession. They forged a decree naming the emperor's weaker son, Hu Hai, as successor instead of the more competent heir. Why? Because Hu Hai was easier to control, a puppet emperor for their puppeteer politics. And so, the greatest emperor China had ever known became cargo, dead weight, and nobody dared say a word. You wonder what that journey must have been like. Riding next to a ruler you served your whole life, now slumped behind a curtain. How many guards whispered prayers before falling asleep near him? How many drivers had to pretend they didn't smell the truth? The whole thing feels like a slow, hollow pantomime, like the world had ended but no one wanted to admit it. And when they finally reached the capital, when they finally began the funeral rites, they kept those lies going. The same fear, the same paranoia. There are no surviving records of a grand state funeral. No clear confirmation of a public burial. Everything went underground, literally and figuratively. The official line was, he had passed peacefully, returned to the capital, and was entombed in accordance with celestial law. The unofficial line? Historians still argue about it. Did his death trigger the rush to seal the tomb? Were the final traps installed in haste? Were hundreds of workers buried to hide the truth? One fringe theory even suggests that the emperor's body never made it back to the central tomb at all, that he was entombed elsewhere in secret to avoid political disruption. Wild? Maybe. But remember, these were people who dragged a corpse across provinces to keep the illusion alive. Still, the most accepted account remains. His body was eventually buried beneath Mount Li. Inside the tomb he spent his life obsessing over, the one with Mercury rivers and celestial ceilings. He finally got what he wanted. Kind of. Because here's the cruel joke. Just a few years after his death, everything he built fell apart. Hu Hai, the puppet son, proved to be a disaster. The dynasty crumbled within a handful of years. The capital was stormed, the bureaucracy collapsed, the laws he'd standardized began to scatter like ashes in the wind. You try to imagine Qin Shi Huang lying in his poison-proof coffin, deep in the earth with rebellion hammering on the surface. Did he know? Did the ground shake? Could a spirit feel failure from beneath a ton of stone? The terracotta soldiers, of course, didn't move. They just stood there, watching nothing, guarding no one. And the man who tried to cheat death ended up like every other human. Still breathless, forgotten by the system he created. The only difference? His dreams were heavier, more expensive, more complicated, and still sealed away. You curl in your bed now, thinking about how hard he fought not to close his eyes. All the rivers and traps and soldiers in the world couldn't protect him from the most basic truth, that every sleep eventually becomes the last one. So now, as your mind floats gently between memory and moonlight, you step into what might be the strangest part of all. How the emperor's dream changed once he was gone. Because you'd think that after all the cruelty, the tomb traps, the statues, the Mercury, Qin Shi Huang would be remembered as a monster, right? A tyrant who couldn't even trust people to fall asleep without asking for permission. But no, not exactly. Because time, like water, smooths the sharpest edges. Centuries after his death, especially during the Han Dynasty, the very regime that replaced his historians began reshaping his image. Still controversial, yes, still feared, but also respected, even admired in a backhanded, sleep-deprived sort of way. He had united China. He had standardized law and language. He had, frankly, done what no one else dared. And over the years, the idea of Qin Shi Huang shifted from that guy who buried scholars alive to the necessary evil who built the house we all now live in. It's the bedtime story version of power. Clean up the mess, fast forward through the horror, and focus on the structure he left behind. Even in modern China, he's a complicated symbol. A man who crushed and created in equal measure. School children learn about his reforms. Tourists visit the Terracotta army, and yet, few seem to linger on the ghosts beneath. There's a saying in Chinese calligraphy circles: ink fades slower than guilt, and it fits. Qin Shi Huang's ink, his monuments, reforms, roads, borders, still shapes the map. But the guilt? That part sleeps much more quietly now. You shift a little under your covers, thinking about how history edits itself. Point one quirky detail. In some later folk traditions, the emperor became a kind of folk anti-hero, a cautionary figure who was too smart for his own good. He shows up in shadow plays, puppet theater, even a few local bedtime stories told by grandmothers who smile too calmly while describing a man who tried to trick the gods. The plot twist: he never appears as sleeping. Not once. Even the mythic versions of Qin Shi Huang are wide-eyed, restlessly wandering, chasing herbs, consulting stars. He is, even in fiction, always awake. Historians still debate whether this unending wakefulness is admiration or warning. Because the story of the emperor is really the story of what happens when you try to outbuild uncertainty. When you pile stone upon stone, thinking you can crush change itself. When you bury every doubt and call it order. It's exhausting, isn't it? A civilization isn't bricks and laws. It's breath. It's rhythm. It's people falling asleep after a long day, not wondering if a hidden crossbow is waiting for them. And yet, Qin Shi Huang gave the world something else. A reminder that trying to preserve yourself in stone means you never melt, never fade, never exhale. Imagine the man himself, sitting in his hidden chamber beneath Mount Lee, the stars carved above, the Mercury glowing dimly beside him. Eyes closed, hands folded, but inside, still calculating. Because he never planned for peace. He planned for permanence. A fringe theory from a Taoist scroll suggests that the emperor believed his tomb would be a seed, not of memory, but of resurrection. That if aligned with the correct stars and seasons, the layout of his burial would allow his soul to rise again. Not reincarnated, not reborn, just reassembled. Like clay. Of course, it never happened. He stayed right there. But you can't help thinking, maybe the afterlife he feared wasn't fire or judgment, it was being forgotten. And that's why he built so much. Not to sleep forever, but to keep someone talking about him. You, for example, lying there now, in your own room, listening to his story, 2,000 years later. Maybe that's all the immortality he ever really needed. Just an echo, just a whisper, just one more pair of eyes picturing him, cold and alone, wrapped in stars, and if he could hear you now, maybe he'd finally close his eyes for a second. But you get to rest without building anything. No walls, no rivers of poison, no soldiers at your door, just your heartbeat, the sound of your breath, and the permission to forget this all by morning. Now you're lying very still, listening to the silence between your breaths, while the emperor, our sleepless builder, drifts further into the background. Not gone, not entirely, just blurred a little by time, like a statue left out in the rain too long. And that's what this section is really about, what got left behind. Because the tomb might be sealed, the soldiers might still stand at attention. But time keeps digging, even when archaeologists don't. Let's start with a simple image. A cracked clay foot, discovered in the 1990s. The soldier it belonged to was otherwise complete, but this foot had been broken not recently but long ago, possibly even during the construction. And here's the quirky part. Someone patched it. Not perfectly, not with ceremony, but just enough to keep the figure standing. A little wedge of earth, a smear of slip, done quietly, no signatures. And you start to wonder, was it done by order or by care? Because what survives from this tomb is less about wealth and more about wear. You see fingerprints in clay. You see brushstrokes under faded pigments. You see the mistakes, the fixes, the quiet work done by hands that knew no one would ever say thank you. There are boot prints pressed into bricks, thumb grooves on helmet molds. One terracotta warrior has the faintest smile, a crooked grin, barely there, like the sculptor tried to sneak it past whoever was checking the line. Historians still debate whether these details were intentional signs of individuality or just accidents. But what's undeniable is that the tomb, for all its grandeur, is full of very human traces, that there's a kind of vulnerability in that. You realize now that this isn't just a story about Qin Shi Huang. It's also about the people who built his dreams. People who carried stone and shaped noses and dug trenches, and then disappeared without a line in the record books. You know, one artisan, in particular, left behind a ceramic shard with 3 characters scratched faintly on the underside. Still breathing now. That's it. That's the whole message. Not rebellion. Not a poem. Just a quiet affirmation in the middle of all that dust and pressure. A whispered "I'm here" to no one in particular. Maybe to themselves. It makes you think about how many lives were folded into this tomb like ingredients in a cake that only one man was ever supposed to eat. Thousands of workers, dozens of engineers, craftsmen, potters, farmers turned stone haulers, and night watchers who hadn't seen their families in years. And when the tomb was finished, most of them vanished, into records, into trenches, or into the cold stone itself. Some were likely buried inside the complex. Others died from illness and exhaustion long before it was finished. And here's the part that stings. They didn't even get their names in the blueprint. Qin Shi Huang's was a tomb for one, but it took a city to build it. And you wonder, did the emperor ever stop just once to look at one of those workers and think, that person gave up their dreams for mine? Probably not. But you did. You see it now. All the silent help behind the history, the cracked fingers, the aching backs, the sleep that was postponed so a stranger could feel immortal. It makes you appreciate your own sleep more, doesn't it? No one's asking you to carve a dynasty tonight. No one expects you to seal a palace with your last breath. You get to rest for free. And as you lie still, you picture that one artisan, carving the edge of a kneeling warrior's foot, scratching in that phrase. Still breathing now. That's your inheritance, too. Not the emperor's fear, not his fury, but the soft defiance of someone who, even surrounded by death and command, chose to mark their presence. Quietly, without permission. So as the tomb dims behind you, and the story grows quieter, you breathe a little slower. Not to escape like Qin Shi Huang did, but to belong. Because sometimes the most radical act is to rest. You're deeper into sleep now, somewhere between the edge of dream and the memory of clay. But the story hasn't quite let go of your hand. It's taking you gently now, past the tomb, into the world that came after. Because when an emperor dies, even one as heavy-handed and stone-sealed as Qin Shi Huang, he doesn't just vanish. His story doesn't end. It gets reinterpreted, recycled, rearranged. That's what happened over the next 2,000 years. His tomb was forgotten, then whispered about, then rediscovered. The myths shifted. His name echoed differently in different ears. And what he built, it lived strange new lives. Let's start with the Terracotta Army, because oh boy, they became celebrities. Since their unearthing in 1974, they've been X-rayed, scanned, cataloged, and, at times, touring the world like sleepy stone rock stars. You've probably seen one in a museum exhibit, posed under dramatic lighting with a plaque that says something like, Kneeling Archer, 3rd century BCE. But here's the quirky thing. No two statues are truly identical. Seriously. The level of variety in their armor, hairstyles, and facial expressions has stunned researchers. Some soldiers look confident, others a little dazed. One looks like he might be seconds from sneezing. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate artistry, or just the byproduct of dozens of workshops all trying to follow the same imperial memo, but with different interpretations. Imagine that you're sculpting for the afterlife, and your boss says make 8,000 faces, but don't repeat a single one. Talk about stress. Even more curious, some scholars now think the figures may have drawn inspiration from Western sculptures. There's a theory, not mainstream but fascinating, that early contact with Greek artisans might have influenced the realism in these statues. A few traces of European DNA have been found in ancient remains nearby, which sparks all kinds of debates about cultural exchange centuries before the Silk Road was officially a thing. Whether true or not, it's poetic. The idea that even an emperor trying to seal himself into a perfectly isolated afterlife might have accidentally let in the world. You shift gently under your blanket, thinking about those statues now. Not as soldiers, but as people. Each one holding its pose for 20 centuries. Unmoving, unguarded, just waiting. Maybe not for war. Maybe not even for the emperor. Maybe they were waiting for us. Because when we found them, when that farmer's well tapped into history, they didn't rise in anger or fall to dust. They just stood there, as if to say, "Took you long enough." Now they're photographed, admired, even 3D printed. Kids draw them in school. Historians write thick books about the curve of their eyebrows. And still, they don't speak. That's the haunting part. They're detailed enough to feel real, close enough to seem human. But they never blink, never shift weight, never exhale. Just like Qin Shi Huang wanted. But outside the museum lights, beyond the documentaries and scholarly footnotes, the real story lingers not in the soldiers, but in the mound itself. The central tomb, still untouched. After all these decades, it remains sealed. On purpose. You may wonder why. After all, we have drones, sensors, robots. Can't we just dig it up and see what's inside? Technically, yes. But ethically, not yet. The concern is that opening it might destroy everything. The tomb chamber is thought to be incredibly fragile. One wrong move, and murals could oxidize, pigments could vanish, centuries of preserved air could escape in a single hiss, so modern archaeologists wait. Some hope that future technology will allow a safer excavation. Others argue we should never open it, that it should remain intact, a sleeping relic, left alone out of respect, or fear, or both. There's a quiet dignity in that, letting some mysteries sleep longer than our curiosity can wait. And you lie in your own bed now, halfway between waking and dreaming, realizing that the real weight of this story isn't the emperor. It's what he left unsaid. The tomb is a silence too big to ignore. It asks you, what does it mean to prepare for eternity and still never be ready? What does it mean to fear being forgotten so much that you build your memory out of stone? And maybe the more important question, what's the cost of turning sleep into strategy? You shift slightly. The sheets rustle. A quieter world surrounds you now. No traps. No Mercury. No empire hanging on your next breath. You don't need to be remembered by 8,000 statues. You just need to be rested for tomorrow. And tomorrow? That's a gift the emperor never really planned for. You're drifting now. The story is dimmer, more blurred around the edges, but still there, humming softly behind your thoughts like a distant drumbeat. We've followed the emperor from cradle to tomb, through rivers of mercury and corridors of clay. But tonight, we have one more detour before sleep finds you fully. Because this chapter isn't about him, exactly. It's about the dream of never dying, and how that idea spread far beyond one emperor's obsession. You see, Qin Shi Huang wasn't alone in his fear. Throughout history, rulers everywhere have tried to dodge death. Build past it. Think it. It's practically a job requirement. If you're powerful enough, you start assuming mortality is optional. And in ancient China, the pursuit of immortality wasn't fringe, it was mainstream science. Well, science-ish. He funded entire expeditions to search for the mythical Isles of the Immortals, rumored to lie somewhere off the eastern coast. Some accounts say he sent ships loaded with hundreds of boys and girls, young, healthy, pure, hoping they'd find the islands and return with the secret. Spoiler, they didn't return. Historians still argue whether these were actual voyages, religious rituals, or symbolic PR stunts, but the record shows money was spent. Orders were issued. People vanished in the name of forever. And the emperor himself, he took alchemy seriously, swallowed mercury pills, drank strange potions, and followed Taoist immortality manuals like they were cheat codes. He surrounded himself with scholars who promised him spiritual escape routes. When those didn't work, he built a tomb as Plan B. Just in case. It's almost sad, isn't it? All that brilliance, all that structure, and underneath it all, just a man afraid of the dark. You shift a little now, comfortable and safe, realizing the emperor was trying to fight something you've already accepted. That rest is not defeat. It's a return. A release. A quirky detail from those same Taoist texts. One alchemist claimed that true immortality was not about avoiding death, but mastering sleep. He who sleeps deeply wakes to longer years. It's beautiful and ironic. Qin Shi Huang likely read those words and thought, cool, how do I weaponize that? You think about how much was wasted in the chase, how many lives were spent, how many forests cleared for tomb tiles, how many futures burned so one man could avoid an ending. And in the end, he got one anyway. He died on a roadside, under heavy robes, surrounded by fish barrels and panicked advisors. You lie still, breathing deeply, and wonder, what would he think if he could see himself now? His statue-faced army boxed in glass, his tomb untouched, tourists buying replica warriors from souvenir stands outside a gate his ghost can't open. The legacy is vast, undeniable, but it's also quiet, contained, lonely. Some scholars suggest the Terracotta army was not meant to fight enemies in the afterlife, but to serve him, to continue his court, his power, his rituals, his routines, an eternal bureaucracy. Imagine that, being so afraid of endings that you bring office meetings into the afterlife. You almost feel sorry for him. Even in death, he couldn't relax. There's a lull here now, a stillness, like walking through a museum long after it's closed. The lights dimmed, the statues less intimidating. You're not afraid anymore. You're just tired. And so, finally, was he. You let your eyes flutter, not to escape the story, but to complete it. Because sleep, unlike emperors, doesn't need a fortress. It just needs surrender. And as you fade, you think of something small. A broken clay toe, a scribbled name on a hidden tile, a breath left behind by a tired worker who didn't want immortality. Just a soft place to lie down. Like you have now. You don't need to outlive the sky. You just need to close your eyes. You're almost there now, drifting low and slow in the quiet belly of the story. The emperor's tomb is behind you, sealed and silent. The soldiers are still. The sky above China darkens into velvet. And for a few minutes more, let's just walk the line between history and dream. Because this story, it doesn't quite end. You see, even with all we know about Mercury rivers, unblinking warriors, and death disguised in ceremony, there's still so much we don't know. The mystery of Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains one of the greatest archaeological puzzles in the world, and we're still just scratching at the surface. Literally. Only a small fraction of the burial complex has been excavated, maybe 1%. Thousands of statues, chambers, and underground corridors still lie untouched beneath the lush soil of Shaanxi province. They're too delicate, too risky, too mysterious. You picture it now. Layers of history folded into the earth like a sleeping scroll. We've glimpsed the edges, but the middle, the heart, that stays hidden. One theory holds that the emperor's actual body may be suspended in a bronze sarcophagus, floating slightly above the mercury streams to prevent decay. It's the kind of image that lives between science fiction and nightmare. There's no proof, of course, just ancient whispers and soil readings and the unspoken rule. Don't open the door unless you're ready to meet what's inside. And here's something strange. A quirky fact that sounds like fiction. The tomb mound itself changes temperature differently than the ground around it. Slightly warmer in winter, slightly cooler in summer. Some blame the materials. Others say it's a sign of buried chambers still sealed tight, climate-controlled by ancient design. Historians still argue whether the inner tomb will ever be safe to open. But deep down, they know what that question's really about. It's not technology. It's not funding. It's not Mercury. It's doubt. Because once you open it, once you really look, there's no going back. The mystery dies. The fear dies. Even the magic dies. And maybe, just maybe, the mystery is more powerful unopened. You understand this, don't you? You're lying still now, eyes half shut, not because you're afraid to wake, but because sleep itself is a little mystery. Something that works better when you don't force it. When you let it happen. The emperor never could. He tried to choreograph the afterlife the way he choreographed his empire. Orders, statues, borders. He tried to bring control into a world that doesn't obey commands. Sleep doesn't care about status. You could be a worker laying bricks or a general with 20 titles, and sleep still knocks the same weight, at a little slower, a little softer, until your eyelids give up. That's the thing Qin Shi Huang never learned. He could dominate every inch of land. But the space behind the eyes? That space can't be ruled. It can only be welcomed. You imagine now the tomb from above. The mound like a patient breath on the landscape. Inside, stillness. Mercury quiet. Clay soldiers standing guard not out of duty, but because they were told to and never given permission to rest. And outside? The modern world spins on. Cars and cell phones. Tour buses and excavators. Wi-Fi and war. But under it all, that soft drumbeat of ancient sleep. Still waiting. Still watching. And you? You get to leave it all behind tonight. No armies. No fear. No emperor whispering about forever. Just your body, your room, the dim echo of a fan maybe humming in the corner, and a story that lets you go. You've listened long enough now. You've walked through time and death and stone. You've felt the weight of a man who tried to sleep without dying. And now, finally, you're allowed to do the opposite. You're allowed to live by resting. The story is quiet now. You're floating just above the last stretch of it. Low and peaceful, like mist over a still field. The soldiers are fading into shadow. The Mercury rivers have gone still. The emperor has stopped speaking. And you, finally, are allowed to listen to the silence. This section is your descent. The part where the lights dim even further. Where the sound of history softens into breath. Because even though the tomb still waits, even though the mysteries endure, the most important part has already happened. You made it through. Not the wars, not the politics, but the weight of the man himself. You've walked alongside Qin Shi Huang. Not to praise him, not to condemn him, but to understand the quiet behind his noise, the silence under his stone, the sleep he tried so desperately to avoid. And maybe the lesson isn't what he left behind, but what he never found. Peace. Let's go there together now. Close your eyes. Let the earth rise around you like the walls of a soft tomb. Not heavy, not cold, but comforting. A wrap of night around the bones of the day. There's a curious thought that some historians have. That Qin Shi Huang's tomb isn't just a monument to fear. It's also a mirror. A place where ambition meets stillness. Where noise is sealed into silence. The first emperor of China unified his land with iron and law, but he could not unify himself. He wanted control, perfection, a dream that never ended. But real rest doesn't come from conquering. It comes from release. You picture the central chamber, still unopened. The emperor lying beneath stars carved in precious stone. The air around him unchanged for over 2,000 years. And you wonder, did he ever dream again? Did his soul, if souls exist, find anything on the other side? Or did he stay clenched even in death, fists tight around a kingdom he could no longer touch? You don't have to clench. You don't have to build a city to protect your sleep. You're safe here. No traps. No orders. No one watching. Your world tonight is soft cotton sheets. The hush of night. The quiet smile of a story that ends just before it answers everything. And that's okay. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that fade gently. Like stone turning to dust. Like power turning to memory. like a name whispered once, then let go. So, sleep now. Forget the clay armies and the golden rivers. Forget the tomb. You're not sealed in, you're set free. Word count 1067. Wind down 300 words. Now, let your breath slow even more. You're floating far from emperors and history now. The story is behind you. A closed book resting on a nightstand you don't need to reach for again. The words have settled. The soil has covered the tomb. Everything is still. You are still. The sounds of the world grow softer. The lights behind your eyelids dim. There's no rush. Nothing to prepare for. Nothing to defend. Just this moment. Just this rest. Let your muscles uncoil. Let your jaw unclench. Let your mind wander to a place with no names, no maps, no rules. A quiet garden, a slow breeze. A gentle hum in the distance. If your thoughts drift, let them. If you feel yourself rising or sinking, that's okay. You are not being watched. You are not being tested. You are simply falling deeper. Even the emperor's tomb, with all its weight and worry, cannot follow you here. This is your space, your silence, your sleep, so let it take you. Let your mind go blank, like a field of untouched snow. Let your body feel heavy, as if the earth is gently holding you instead of asking anything more. You've heard enough tonight, you've seen enough, you've done enough. Now close the last door behind your thoughts, and rest. Really rest. Sleep, not like a king, but like someone who has nothing left to prove.